In the closing weeks of 1970, the badly burned remains of a female victim were discovered lying on the side of an isolated Norwegian valley. Her true identity has continued to elude the authorities right up until this very day. In this story, we ask, who was the Isdal Woman? The historic city of Bergen, lying on Norway's western coast, is situated at the centre of a mountain chain known locally as the Seven Mountains. The largest of these features is Mount Ulriken, which lies to the southeast of the city, rising to an imposing 643 metres. Of the many well-known hiking trails threading their way across its slopes, the most popular is situated in the Isdalen Valley, which runs along Ulriken's northern face. It was here that on a bitterly cold November evening in 1970, a solitary hiker descending the mountain encountered 3 other people travelling up the path. As the figures slowly approached from the opposite direction, he was taken aback by how out of place they looked amidst their rural surroundings. Pacing slightly ahead was a middle-aged woman, quite well dressed, but clearly feeling the effects of not wearing any protective outer garments. Behind her walked 2 imposing men, both dressed in dark clothing, but also ill-prepared for the conditions, wearing only lightweight jackets and casual footwear. As the distance closed between them, the hiker was struck by her beauty, though something of a haunted expression dominated her features. As she neared him, she slowed her pace and reached out as if to take his hand. One of the 2 men then moved swiftly to her side, and she was brusquely hurried along without managing to say anything. The hiker stopped and watched as the 3 figures continued along the path until they passed out of sight. She had needed his help, that much was clear, but he doubted he could have handled the 2 men on his own. Quickening his pace, the lone hiker continued his journey, resolving to report the matter. Today's video is sponsored by Aura, and it's a really important time to be talking about them because over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, which were reportedly released for free online. If you weren't taking precautions before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You can go to my link aura.com/bedtime stories to try 14 days for free. That's enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. Aura alerts you if they find your phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They'll let you know fast if anyone tries to use this information to access your credit or bank accounts, plus a bunch of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one app. Should the worst case scenario happen, they provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Don't leave you or your family vulnerable to data breaches. Go to aura.com/bedtime stories to try 2 weeks for free. The following morning, he arrived at the local police station and related the encounter to the desk officer. His efforts were met with little more than a shrug and a sigh, and instead, he was questioned as to why it was any of his business. Resentful of the policeman's disinterested tone, the young man left the station and put the matter behind him. 5 days later, he would receive a brutal, unwanted reminder of the encounter. There, emblazoned across the front page of his morning newspaper, was a headline announcing that the remains of a woman had been found mutilated on the windswept slopes of Mount Ulriken. The Isdal Valley already had a dark and grisly past, even prior to the discovery of her corpse on the morning of November the 29th. Known colloquially as Death Valley, the region had long been a popular location for suicide attempts, with more than one frozen corpse having to be manhandled down its flanks by mountain rescue workers. The victim on this occasion had been discovered by a man walking with his 2 teenage daughters. As the family had proceeded along the main trail, they spotted what looked like a suitcase full of clothes painstakingly laid atop one of the nearby boulders, almost as if it had been ceremonial in nature. On closer inspection, they discovered the corpse of a woman, concealed between the large rocks and having apparently been burned to death. Recoiling in horror, the man grabbed hold of his children and hurried off to call the police. The attending officers were appalled by the extreme efforts which had been taken to hide the victim's identity. As they approached, the air had been thick with the sickly stench of burned human flesh. The victim's facial features were totally destroyed, reduced to a charred mess. On closer inspection, the tips of her fingers had been abraded by a tool of some kind, in an apparent attempt to render her fingertips unrecognizable. Except for her lower back, which had been resting on the ground, and where her shoulders and upper arms had been wedged tightly against the rocks either side, the rest of the body and its clothing was entirely burned and blackened. One of the officers had paused to pick up a brown fur hat which lay nearby, and discovered that it smelled strongly of petrol. It appeared as if the deceased had been soaked with the accelerant and then set alight. In addition to items of jewellery and a broken umbrella, there was an empty bottle of cheap liqueur, an emptied packet of phenomenal sleeping tablets, and a few water bottles which were half full. Any documentation that might have identified her, such as a passport or identity card, seemed to have been removed. Sickened and bewildered by what they saw, the officers set about recovering the body for further examination. The results of the subsequent post-mortem did little to assist the police inquiry. Whilst livid bruising was found and photographed at the base of the victim's neck, indicating she had been violently incapacitated, this was determined not to be the cause of death. Instead, it was found that she had been poisoned as a result of ingesting at least 50 of the sleeping pills. The coroner was unable to determine if she might have still been alive when she was set alight. It was also discovered that any brand labels and identifying features from the clothes she wore had been cut away, making it impossible to trace them back to a point of sale. For several days, the detectives assigned to the case made little headway, until a breakthrough occurred when partial fingertip samples, removed from the body during the autopsy, were found to correspond with 2 suitcases that had been found discarded on the platform of one of Bergen's busy central train stations. The cases had clearly been searched and tampered with. Some skin lotion with a prescription was recovered, but the section that would have identified the medical practice and doctor it originated from had been cut away. 2 different sums of money were concealed in the lining of the case, 500 German Deutschmarks and 130 Norwegian kroner. There was also a postcard from an Italian photographer who lived and worked in the city. When officers tracked this photographer down, they were sure he would be able to shed some light on the woman's identity, but this again turned into a dead end. He admitted to having met the woman and taken her to dinner, during which she had told him she was from Johannesburg and was on a 6-month visit to Norway's most popular tourist locations. He had never seen her again after the meal, and when contact was made with the South African consulate, it was determined she had lied about her nationality. With no leads generated from appeals for information in the Norwegian press, photos and sketches of the woman were circulated to European news agencies and various branches of Interpol. Eventually, this wider appeal led to a flood of information in relation to the case, though none of it ever managed to verify the victim's identity. Prior to arriving in Norway, it was discovered she had travelled to a host of other European countries, utilising a variety of manufactured passports and identities wherever she went. The list of 9 fake names included Genevieve Lancia, Claudia Schelt, Vera Schlosserneck, and Claudia Nielsen. Witnesses stated that the woman was fluent in several different languages, including German and Flemish, and had also used fake wigs and hair dyes to further alter her identity. She had offered the people she interacted with various backstories, including that she was an antiques dealer and a travelling salesperson. Eventually, after several fruitless years, the case was closed by the Norwegian police, citing a suspected suicide. From time to time, public interest would be revived by articles in the national media, only to subside again when no new leads were generated. Neither the woman nor the 2 men she was with on that fateful November evening have ever been identified. The official suicide verdict, which was recorded by the Norwegian coroner, has never been fully accepted, either by the general public or anyone closely connected to the case. Whilst it is conceivable that the Isdal woman concealed her identity before overdosing on prescription medication, it would have been impossible to later wedge herself between the rocks and then self-immolate, given the incapacitating effects of having taken so many sleeping pills. This suggests that another party must have been involved in the attempt to destroy her remains, most likely one or both the unknown men who were last seen with her. The first and most sinister scenario is that she was taken there by them against her will, with her last desperate attempt to speak with the young hiker thwarted by her captors. She was then forced to consume the sleeping tablets before being felled by a blow to the back of the neck, then tucked into the rocks and set ablaze. An alternative scenario has the men destroying her body at her own request, after she had committed suicide. It is possible that whatever secret she had gone to such lengths to conceal was one that she wanted to take to her grave, and her escorts on that day were there to assist her in this. A third, more outlandish theory is that given the meticulous manner in which her belongings were removed from her body and laid out, the death was some form of ritual sacrifice, containing a hidden meaning that could only be known to those involved. It has long been suggested that the Isdal woman may have been an international spy, given that the incident occurred at the height of the Cold War. Norway was a hotbed of espionage activity during the conflict, as it sat directly on the border between the Western powers and the neighbouring Soviet bloc. The fact that she had easy access to a host of new identities and matching fake passports indicates she must have been associated with a well-controlled and financed organisation. One of the other items found in the 2 abandoned suitcases by the investigating officers was a small diary filled with handwritten coded entries. Whilst the actual messages have yet to be deciphered, there seems to be some correlation between the dates entered and the woman's movements throughout the country that year and the testing of a new missile system called the Penguin. This idea is supported by the testimony of a local fisherman who contacted authorities during the appeal for information and stated that he had seen her near the northern city of Stavanger at the same time a large military exercise was taking place there. The circumstances surrounding the death of the Isdal woman are strikingly similar to another mysterious death that occurred in Australia, known as the Tamam Shud case. On the morning of the 1st of December 1948, the body of an unidentified male in his 40s was found slumped against the seawall at Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide. Whilst the Somerton man's cause of death was never fully ascertained, it bore all the hallmarks of a poisoning. Once again, labels had been removed from the clothing he was wearing, and a suitcase abandoned at a nearby train station had been similarly searched and stripped of any possible identifying features. He was also in possession of papers containing handwritten coded notes, and was suspected to have been operating in the country as a spy at the time of his death. In 2017, following further speculation and discussion about the case in online internet platforms, the Norwegian police decided to instigate a cold case review of the Isdal woman's death. To date, the DNA samples taken from her body nearly 40 years ago have still failed to correlate with anything on the Interpol database, but a new analytical technique carried out by the University of Bergen did manage to uncover further evidence about her origins. Previous analysis of the handwriting samples taken from the woman's diary suggested she had been educated in a Western European country, with France being the strongest possibility. The staff at the university then analysed the isotopes in the teeth that were removed from her body, hoping this would hold some insight into where she may have lived during her younger years. What they discovered was that she had most likely been born and raised in Germany in the 1930s, with the data favouring Nuremberg as her town of origin. As an older child, she had moved out of Germany to a neighbouring country, which is believed to have been either France or Belgium. There was also evidence that at some point in her life, she had undergone expensive dental surgery in a non-European location, such as South America or Asia. This suggests that the Isdal woman grew up in Nazi Germany and would have been repatriated to one of the victorious Allied nations at the conclusion of World War II. Following the outbreak of the Cold War, she may have lived on the western side of the Iron Curtain. In her older years, she had then ended up working for an employer who had sent her to faraway and exotic locations, potentially a Western intelligence agency. Whichever side she worked for as the conflict continued, her duties would have taken her through unoccupied European countries, where it appears she spent time observing and documenting events for her employers. In due course, her actions garnered unwanted attention, prompting someone to deem her a significant threat, which necessitated immediate intervention. We may never know if it was her enemies that went to such great lengths to hide her true identity, or indeed her employers, when they found she had been killed. All we do know is that her life was ended in a cold and clinical manner, hidden away from prying eyes. On the 5th of February 1971, she was given a Catholic funeral and buried in an unmarked grave. But what is staggering is that even if she didn't have any immediate family, it is almost inconceivable that another relative of hers has not had their DNA entered on record somewhere during the subsequent years. One reason for this, especially if the Isdal woman did grow up during the horrors and upheaval of the Second World War, is that her entire family and the records of their existence were wiped out. Another is that her identity might well be known to the powers that be, but because the level of espionage she was involved in was so secretive, it has been covered up and hidden from the public. Whatever her beliefs and motivations were, the manner in which this helpless soul was killed is truly saddening. It is our hope that one day her identity will become known, and that her full story can finally be told to the world.